The temperature drops to 40 below zero in the deep forests of northern Minnesota. Ice crystals form in the air itself, creating a fog that seems alive, writhing between the black spruce trees like ghostly fingers. This is where the screaming started. Two hikers found their tent shredded, their supplies scattered across the frozen ground, and tracks in the snow that shouldn't exist. The prints were human but wrong. Too long, too deep. The stride pattern suggested something over 8 feet tall, walking on 2 legs through waist-deep snow as if it weighed nothing at all. The local search and rescue team called it a bear attack. They always do, but the hikers knew better. They'd heard the stories whispered in the logging towns, the warnings passed down through generations of indigenous families, the name that makes even hardened trappers fall silent. They'd encountered something that officially doesn't exist. Something that has stalked these frozen forests since before recorded history. Something the Algonquian peoples called the Wendigo. Picture this. You're alone in a cabin, miles from civilization. The nearest town is a 3-day hike through dense forest. Outside, the temperature plummets as darkness falls. The wind dies to nothing. The forest goes completely silent. No owls, no wolves. Even the trees stop creaking. Then you hear it. A sound that doesn't belong to any animal you know. Part scream, part howl, part something else entirely. It echoes through the valley, bouncing off frozen lakes and snow-covered ridges until you can't tell which direction it came from. Your breath fogs the window as you peer into the darkness. That's when you see the eyes. Yellow, glowing, 15 feet off the ground. The Wendigo legend emerges from the darkest corners of North American folklore, born in the territories of the Algonquian-speaking peoples. The Ojibwe, Cree, Innu, and Naskapi nations all carry variations of this tale, each more terrifying than the last. But this isn't just another campfire story. The Wendigo represents something far more disturbing. A warning encoded in myth, a psychological horror that blurs the line between supernatural predator and the monster that hunger can make of any human being. In Algonquian tradition, the Wendigo appears as an emaciated giant, its skin pulled tight over bones that protrude at impossible angles. Some describe it with antlers sprouting from its skull like a perverted crown. Others speak of yellow fangs, lips torn away from endless chewing, leaving a skull-like grin permanently frozen on its face. Its eyes burn with an unnatural light, visible through blizzards and the darkest nights. The creature stands anywhere from 15 to 30 feet tall, yet moves through deep snow without leaving tracks when it chooses. It smells of decay and copper, the scent of old blood frozen in ice. But here's what makes the Wendigo truly terrifying. It was once human. Every Wendigo started as a person who crossed a line that should never be crossed. In the depths of winter, when game disappears and supplies run out, when starvation claws at your insides and frost blackens your fingers, the human mind can break. The Algonquian peoples knew this danger intimately. They knew that in those desperate moments, a person might look at their companion and see not a friend, but meat. Once that line is crossed, once human flesh passes human lips, the transformation begins. The hunger never stops. That's the curse. No matter how much the Wendigo consumes, it remains eternally starving, growing larger with each victim, ensuring it can never eat enough to satisfy its appetite. It becomes a walking metaphor for insatiable greed, for the consumption that consumes the consumer. The indigenous peoples understood something we've forgotten in our modern world. Some hungers, once awakened, can never be satisfied. They only grow stronger. Historical accounts of Wendigo encounters stretch back centuries, recorded in the journals of fur traders, missionaries, and explorers who ventured into the Canadian wilderness. In 1661, Jesuit missionaries documented stories from the Algonquin peoples about entire villages abandoned overnight, the inhabitants fleeing from something they refused to name directly. The missionaries initially dismissed these as pagan superstitions. That changed after the winter of 1665, when a trading post on the shores of Lake Superior fell silent. The supply team found it 3 months later. Every structure intact. No signs of struggle. 37 people vanished without a trace. The only clue was a series of scratches on the main cabin door, 15 feet up, as if something massive had tried to claw its way inside. The Hudson's Bay Company archives contain dozens of reports from the 18th and 19th centuries. Trappers refusing to enter certain valleys. Native guides abandoning expeditions when they found specific track patterns in the snow. In 1786, a company factor named Duncan Mackenzie wrote in his journal about a sound that followed his team for 3 days through the forests near Lake Athabasca. He described it as the cry of a man in the uttermost extremity of pain, yet somehow hungry, as if pain and hunger had become the same sensation. His team of 12 men emerged from the forest with only 7. The missing 5 were never found. But perhaps the most disturbing historical accounts are those that blur the line between legend and documented fact. In 1878, Swift Runner, a Cree trapper from Alberta, emerged from the wilderness claiming a Wendigo spirit had possessed him. He led authorities to his winter camp, where they discovered the remains of his wife and 5 children. Swift Runner had killed and consumed them during a particularly harsh winter, despite a Hudson's Bay Company post being only 25 miles away with ample supplies. During his trial, he insisted he'd been transformed into a Wendigo, describing an overwhelming compulsion he couldn't resist. The court dismissed his claims of possession. They hanged him at Fort Saskatchewan in December 1879. But here's what the official records don't emphasize. 3 other families in the same region reported similar incidents that winter. All claimed Wendigo possession. All had access to nearby supplies. It's as if something spread through those camps, something that had nothing to do with actual starvation. The Catholic Church documented 17 cases of suspected Wendigo psychosis between 1800 and 1920 in the James Bay region alone. Missionaries reported that affected individuals displayed remarkable consistency in their symptoms. Initial isolation and refusal to eat normal food. Claims of smelling human flesh everywhere. Descriptions of other people appearing as animals or food. Finally, violent attempts at cannibalism, often targeting family members first. The church treated these as cases of Satan's influence. The indigenous communities knew better. They had their own methods of dealing with suspected Wendigos, methods the Canadian government eventually outlawed as murder, though many argued it was communal self-defense against an existential threat. Jack Fiddler, an Ojibwe chief and shaman, claimed to have defeated 14 Wendigos in his lifetime. In 1907, Canadian authorities arrested him and his brother Joseph for the murder of a woman named Wasakapikwe. Fiddler insisted she'd been turning into a Wendigo and that killing her was the only way to prevent her from consuming her entire family. During the trial, multiple witnesses testified they'd seen Wasakapikwe's physical transformation beginning, her teeth growing longer, her eyes reflecting light like an animal's, her inability to eat anything while constantly talking about her hunger. Fiddler died in custody before the trial concluded, but his case raised uncomfortable questions. Either an entire community shared the same delusion, or they witnessed something that doesn't fit our understanding of reality. The stories continue into the modern era, though they're often dismissed or explained away. In 1951, a group of forest rangers in northern Ontario reported finding a circle of abandoned camps. 7 different hunting parties had fled the area within a 2-week period. Each group independently described the same thing: a tall, emaciated figure watching them from just beyond their fire's light. The sound of breathing that seemed to come from above their tents. The overwhelming feeling of being hunted. The rangers investigated for 3 days before they too abandoned the area, refusing to file an official report about what they'd encountered. Consider the account of Robert Morrison, a trapper working the forests near Kenora in 1996. Morrison was experienced, rational, not given to flights of fancy. He'd spent 30 years in the wilderness, knew every predator, every sound the forest could make. But that November, something changed. He started finding his trap lines disturbed. Not robbed, but examined. The tracks around them were almost human but elongated, with a stride that would require someone 7 feet tall. Then his cabin began receiving visits. Something would circle it at night, scraping against the walls, testing the door, tapping on the windows with what sounded like fingernails. Morrison tried to photograph it, but his camera malfunctioned in the cold. He tried to track it, but the trails always led to nothing, as if the creature simply vanished. After 2 weeks of escalating encounters, Morrison abandoned his cabin and never returned. When interviewed years later, he would only say that some things are better left alone, that there are still places in this world where humans aren't meant to go. The pattern repeats across decades of encounters. In 2001, a geological survey team in Manitoba reported equipment vandalized by something with enormous strength. Their sealed food stores were torn open and scattered, but not eaten. Cameras captured only darkness and eyeshine at impossible heights. The team evacuated after one member claimed to see a figure standing motionless in their camp, visible only in peripheral vision, disappearing when looked at directly. In 2008, a group of university students conducting environmental research near Thunder Bay described being stalked for 3 days by something that walked upright but moved through the forest without disturbing the undergrowth. They recorded audio of what they insisted were words spoken in Ojibwe, though the voice was distorted, multiplied, as if several people were speaking in unison through a throat not designed for human speech. Local Ojibwe elders who heard the recording refused to translate it, saying some words should not be repeated. Perhaps most unsettling are the accounts from park rangers working in the remote regions of Minnesota's boundary waters. They speak in hushed tones about the winter of 2015, when 7 different camping parties reported the same experience on the same night, despite being miles apart. Each group described waking to find something massive standing at the edge of their camp, watching, not approaching, not threatening, just observing with eyes that reflected their flashlight beams like a nocturnal predator. The figure remained motionless for exactly 1 hour, then walked backward into the forest, maintaining eye contact until it disappeared into the darkness. The Park Service officially attributed the sightings to a large bear exhibiting unusual behavior. Privately, rangers avoid certain areas during winter months. Let me paint you a picture of a more recent encounter, one that hasn't made it into any official report. January 2019. A couple, experienced winter campers, decided to ski into the backcountry near Lake Nipigon. We'll call them Sarah and Michael, though those aren't their real names. They've asked to remain anonymous, fearing ridicule or worse, that talking about it might somehow invite it back. The first 2 nights were perfect. Clear skies, temperatures around -20 Celsius, the kind of pristine winter wilderness that makes the hardship worthwhile. They'd set up camp in a sheltered valley, surrounded by old-growth pine and spruce. On the 3rd night, the weather changed. Not a storm, but something else. The temperature dropped so fast their breath turned to ice crystals that fell like snow inside their tent. The forest went silent in a way Sarah described as oppressive, like the world holding its breath. Around midnight, they heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling their camp. Michael grabbed his flashlight and unzipped the tent. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees and snow. But the footsteps continued, now on the opposite side of camp from where the light pointed. They seemed to move independently of any visible source, as if the sound and the thing making it existed in different spaces. Sarah started recording with her phone. In the playback, you can hear their breathing, rapid and panicked. You can hear the footsteps, heavy enough to compress the snow with sharp crunching sounds. And underneath it all, barely audible, something else. A whisper that sounds like wind through bones, forming words in a language neither of them recognized. The recording lasts 17 minutes before cutting off abruptly. Sarah says that's when they saw it. At the edge of their vision, where the flashlight beam began to fade, stood a figure. Impossibly tall, its head reached the lower branches of trees 30 feet high. Its body was wrong, too thin for its height, joints bending in ways that hurt to perceive. What they remember most clearly were its eyes, reflecting the light like a deer's but maintaining an intelligence that was distinctly and horribly human. It didn't move like an animal. It stood there with the patience of something that had all the time in the world, something that knew exactly what it was doing. Michael tried to photograph it, but his camera showed only darkness and 2 points of light. Sarah grabbed the emergency satellite beacon, prepared to call for help, but stopped. What would they say? What help could possibly come in time? The figure took 1 step forward, just one, and the tent fabric began to freeze, ice spreading across it in patterns that looked almost like reaching fingers. The couple huddled together, unable to look away, unable to move, trapped in a moment that stretched like winter itself. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the figure turned and walked into the forest. Not away from them, but through the trees, its form seeming to pass between the solid trunks like smoke. The footsteps continued for several minutes, growing distant but never quite fading completely. Sarah and Michael didn't sleep. They didn't speak. They waited for dawn, packed in silence, and skied out by a different route, adding miles to avoid passing through that valley again. When they finally reached their vehicle, they discovered something that still haunts them. Their GPS tracker showed their route clearly for the first 2 days. Then nothing. According to the device, they hadn't moved for 3 days. But their food supplies were depleted correctly, their phone timestamps were accurate, and they had clear memories of each day. Somehow, for 72 hours, they'd existed in a place that technology couldn't record, a blank space on the map where something ancient still walks. The couple sought out indigenous elders in the area, hoping for answers or at least understanding. One elder, a woman who'd lived near Lake Nipigon for 80 years, listened to their story without interruption. When they finished, she simply said, "You were marked but not chosen. Be grateful. Never go back. Some hungers notice when they're being watched, and noticing back is how they feed." This is the pattern that emerges from modern encounters. The Wendigo doesn't just hunt, tests, it observes. It seems drawn to isolation, to the places where civilization thins out and older rules apply. Witnesses consistently describe the same details: the impossible height, the emaciated form, the eyes that hold too much intelligence, the patience of something that exists outside normal time, and always, the feeling of hunger radiating from it like heat from a fire, a hunger that seems to pull at something deep inside the witness, awakening appetites they didn't know they had. Dr. Timothy Blackwood, a psychiatrist who spent 15 years working with indigenous communities in northern Canada, documented over 40 cases of what he termed Wendigo syndrome. His patients described not just sightings but invasive thoughts that followed encounters, persistent dreams of consuming raw flesh, intrusive fantasies about violence against loved ones, a growing sense that other people were somehow less real, more like objects or food than fellow humans. Most disturbing, several patients independently described feeling like something was growing inside them, not physically but psychologically, as if the encounter had planted a seed that was slowly germinating. Blackwood's research was cut short in 2011 when he abruptly closed his practice and moved to Arizona, citing health concerns. Colleagues report he became increasingly paranoid in his final months up north, installing multiple locks on his office door, refusing to see patients after dark, and burning all his case files before leaving. When pressed for details, he would only say that some forms of mental illness might not originate in the mind at all, that perhaps what we call psychosis is sometimes the psyche's reaction to contact with something genuinely outside human experience. The indigenous peoples of North America have always understood the Wendigo as more than a creature. It's a teaching, a warning, a boundary. The Wendigo represents the ultimate violation of natural law, the transformation that occurs when a human chooses to consume human flesh. But it also embodies larger concepts: greed that grows by feeding, isolation that breeds monsters, the thin line between civilization and savagery that winter can erase in a heartbeat. Some indigenous scholars argue that the Wendigo legend served a crucial social function. In small communities surviving brutal winters, the taboo against cannibalism had to be absolute. The Wendigo myth reinforced this boundary with supernatural consequences. Eat human flesh even to survive, and you forfeit your humanity forever. You become something that must be destroyed for the safety of everyone else. It's a powerful psychological deterrent, using fear to maintain social order when survival is uncertain. But this explanation, comforting as it might be to skeptics, doesn't account for all the details. It doesn't explain the consistency of sightings across cultures that had limited contact. It doesn't explain the physical evidence, the tracks, the scratches, the photographs that show something even if we can't quite make out what. Most of all, it doesn't explain the encounters that continue to this day, reported by people with no knowledge of the legend, describing details that match centuries-old accounts with uncanny precision. Consider the case files from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, obtained through Freedom of Information requests. Between 1920 and 2020, there are over 300 reports of missing persons in specific regions of Northern Ontario, Manitoba, and Alberta. These aren't random distributions. They cluster around particular valleys, certain stretches of forest, specific frozen lakes. The official explanations vary. Animal attacks, exposure, accidental deaths. But indigenous communities have their own maps of these regions, passed down through generations. They call them hungry places. They're areas where the barrier between our world and something else grows thin, where the wrong thought at the wrong moment can invite something in. The Wendigo might be understood as a kind of contagion, not viral or bacterial, but something that spreads through consciousness itself. Every culture has concepts that act like cognitive hazards, ideas that damage the mind simply by being contemplated. The Wendigo is perhaps the most visceral of these, literalizing the metaphor of consuming others, of hunger that destroys both the eater and the eaten. Modern psychology has a term for Wendigo psychosis, categorizing it as a culture-bound syndrome, a mental illness specific to certain cultural contexts. But this clinical language feels inadequate when you read the accounts, when you hear the recordings, when you see the fear in the eyes of witnesses who have no reason to lie. They've encountered something that challenged their understanding of reality, something that official explanations can't quite contain. There's a recorded interview from 1973, archived at the University of Manitoba, that captures something of this inadequacy. An elderly Cree man, identified only as Joseph, describes his encounter with a Wendigo in 1921. His English is halting, learned late in life, but his certainty is absolute. He speaks of tracking a moose through heavy snow, following it into a valley he'd never entered before despite knowing the area since childhood. The moose trail ended abruptly, not as if the animal had doubled back or leaped aside, but as if it had simply ceased to exist mid-stride. Where the tracks ended, Joseph found something else. Marks in the snow that suggested something had descended from above, grabbed the moose, and lifted it straight up. No blood, no struggle, just absence. He looked up then into the canopy of pines and saw it. The thing was wrapped around the tree trunk 40 feet up, its limbs twisted in impossible configurations to maintain its grip. It was eating, but not like any predator Joseph had ever observed. It seemed to be absorbing the moose, pulling it into itself without chewing, the flesh flowing like water into its expanding form. Joseph ran. He left his rifle, his pack, everything except the need to put distance between himself and that valley. He never returned for his equipment. He never hunted again. For 50 years, he told no one except his wife, afraid that speaking of it would somehow make it real again, bring it back into the world through the door of memory. Only near death did he agree to the interview, wanting the truth preserved even if it wouldn't be believed. The interview ends with Joseph making a distinction that anthropologists have puzzled over since. He insists that what he saw wasn't the Wendigo, not exactly. It was something becoming a Wendigo, still in transformation, caught between human and other. He claimed you could still see the human features beneath the distortion, the face of someone he almost recognized from a trading post, someone who'd disappeared the previous winter. This detail, the idea that Wendigos exist in various stages of transformation, appears in multiple accounts but is often overlooked by researchers focused on the fully transformed creature of legend. This brings us to the most unsettling possibility. If the Wendigo transformation is a process rather than an instant change, how many people are currently in those early stages? How many have heard the call, felt the first stirrings of impossible hunger, but haven't yet crossed the final threshold? The indigenous traditions speak of warning signs: increased isolation, aversion to cooked food, dreams of running through forests on legs that aren't quite human, the sensation of being too large for your skin, and most tellingly, the perception that other people smell like food. In 2017, a park ranger named David Crenshaw working in the Boundary Waters reported a series of disturbing incidents that suggest this process might be more common than we realize. Over the course of a winter season, he encountered 7 different solo hikers in remote areas, all exhibiting similar behaviors. They moved through deep snow with unusual ease. They seemed unbothered by temperatures that should have been life-threatening given their light clothing. Most unsettling, each one tried to convince Crenshaw to follow them deeper into the wilderness, claiming they'd found something he needed to see. Crenshaw, following protocol, reported each encounter and tried to ensure the hikers' safety. But when he checked registration records, no one matching their descriptions had signed into the park. Trail cameras that should have captured their passages showed nothing. It's as if they existed in some parallel version of the forest, visible only when they chose to be. Crenshaw requested a transfer the following spring. In his exit interview, he made an observation that haunts those who've read the report. He said all 7 hikers had the same expression, not just similar but identical, as if something was wearing their faces without quite understanding how human expressions worked. The Wendigo presents us with a paradox. The more we try to rationalize it, the more it slips through our explanations. It exists in the space between metaphor and reality, between psychology and physics, between ancient wisdom and modern incomprehension. Every attempt to categorize it only emphasizes how much we've forgotten about the world we inhabit, how many mysteries persist in the places we've convinced ourselves are fully mapped and understood. There's a story, recent enough that the witnesses are still alive, that illustrates this perfectly. In December 2020, during the depths of pandemic isolation, a family of 4 decided to winter at their remote cabin near Algonquian Park. They wanted escape from the modern world, a return to simpler times. What they found was that some simplicities have teeth. The first week passed peacefully. They chopped wood, played board games, enjoyed the silence that only winter forests can provide. On day 8, their daughter, age 9, mentioned a tall friend who watched her from the trees. The parents, assuming an imaginary companion born of isolation, played along. By day 10, their son, age 11, was also talking about the tall friend. He drew pictures of it. Stick figure drawings that showed something impossibly elongated, always smiling, always watching from between the trees. The parents grew concerned but tried to remain rational. Children in isolation often share fantasies. It wasn't until day 12 that the father saw it himself. He was splitting wood in the fading afternoon light when he noticed something wrong with one of the trees. It was too tall, too straight, and it was breathing. Steam rose from what he'd thought was bark, but now recognized as skin pulled tight over ribs. The thing wasn't hiding among the trees. It was pretending to be one. The family left that night, driving through a blizzard rather than spending another hour in proximity to whatever had been watching them. The children cried for hours, not from fear but from loss. They insisted the tall friend had been nice, had told them stories, had promised to teach them how to survive the winter without fire, without food, without the weaknesses that make humans so fragile. The parents found this more terrifying than any threat would have been. The thing hadn't come to hunt them. It had come to recruit them. This is perhaps the evolution of the Wendigo legend, its adaptation to a modern world. It no longer needs to chase us through forests, can simply wait, patient as winter, for us to come to it. Every year, more people seek escape in the wilderness. Every year, some of them find more than they bargained for. And every year, a few don't come back quite the same, carrying something inside them that waits for the right moment, the right hunger, the right cold snap to complete its transformation. Dr. Sarah Winters, an anthropologist who spent 2 decades studying Wendigo accounts, proposes a chilling theory. She suggests the Wendigo isn't a species but a condition, one that humans are uniquely susceptible to. She points to the consistency of reports across centuries, the way encounters cluster around specific geographical features, the recurring theme of transformation rather than simple predation. In her words, we might be looking at something more akin to a supernatural ecology, where certain environments, under certain conditions, can trigger changes in human physiology and psychology that our science isn't equipped to measure. Winters has mapped reported encounters against various environmental factors: temperature gradients, magnetic field anomalies, underground water systems, even the presence of specific minerals in the bedrock. The patterns that emerge are striking. Wendigo sightings concentrate in areas where multiple unusual factors converge: places where the normal rules seem softer, more negotiable. These locations, what she calls transformation zones, remain relatively stable over time. The same valleys that appeared in fur trader journals still produce reports today. But here's what Dr. Winters won't say publicly, what she's only shared with a few trusted colleagues. In 2019, she entered one of these transformation zones herself, equipped with every recording device and sensor she could carry. For 3 days, her equipment functioned normally, documenting nothing unusual beyond some minor magnetic fluctuations. On the 4th day, everything changed. Her recordings from that day are 12 hours of static interrupted by what sounds like breathing, though she swears she was alone. Her written notes become increasingly frantic, describing a growing certainty that she was being invited to join something ancient and patient. The final entry, scrawled so violently it tore through 3 pages, simply says, "The hunger is the door." Winters destroyed most of her equipment upon returning, claiming technical malfunction. But she kept one photograph, taken in the pre-dawn darkness of that 4th day. It shows her own footprints in the snow, but beside them, keeping perfect pace, are tracks that shouldn't exist. They match her stride exactly but are 3 times the size, as if something massive was walking with her, matching her movements, teaching her how to move through the forest with inhuman grace. She has no memory of anything walking beside her. In her words, "Either something was there that I couldn't perceive or I was becoming something I couldn't perceive. I'm not sure which possibility is worse." The question that haunts researchers like Winters is whether the Wendigo represents an external threat or an internal potential. Are these creatures that hunt us, or are they what we become when the right circumstances align? The indigenous traditions suggest both might be true. The Wendigo is simultaneously the predator in the forest and the predator within, the monster that stalks us and the monster we might become. This duality appears in the most recent documented encounter, one that occurred just this past January 2024. A group of ice fishers on Lake of the Woods reported something that defies easy categorization. They'd been fishing the same spot for 3 days when they noticed another shelter had appeared overnight about 100 yards away. Not unusual in itself, except no one had seen or heard anyone arrive. No vehicles on the ice, no tracks in the snow. The shelter was simply there, as if it had crystallized out of the winter air. Curiosity eventually overcame caution. 2 of the group approached the shelter, calling out greetings. No response. The shelter was modern, expensive, the kind serious ice fishers use for week-long expeditions. But something was wrong with it. The proportions were off. The door was too tall, the windows too high, as if built for someone much larger than normal. Inside, they could see a figure, sitting motionless in the darkness, facing away from them. They called out again. The figure turned its head, just its head, rotating much further than a human neck should allow. The face was human. One of them swears he recognized it from a missing person poster, but stretched like taffy, features distorted by impossible bone structure beneath. It smiled, revealing far too many teeth, and spoke a single word in perfect English. Soon, the ice fishers retreated to their own shelter and watched. For 6 hours, the figure didn't move again. Then, as the sun set, the entire shelter began to sink into the ice as if it weighed tons. No cracking, no breaking, just a slow submersion that left no trace. By full dark, it was gone. The ice where it had been was solid, showing no sign it had ever been disturbed. The only evidence was the video one of them managed to record on his phone, showing the shelter disappearing into solid ice that never broke. When they reported the incident, conservation officers found something troubling. The missing person one fisher thought he recognized had disappeared 3 years ago, also while ice fishing, also on Lake of the Woods but 50 miles away. His shelter and equipment were found intact, but he was gone. His fishing hole had frozen over, and beneath the new ice, investigators found scratches that suggested something had pulled him down from below. The case was classified as accidental drowning, but the scratches were made from underneath the ice, pulling downward into water that was only 4 feet deep. These modern encounters share a quality that distinguishes them from historical accounts. The Wendigo, if that's what we're calling it, seems to be learning, adapting to our world rather than simply haunting its edges. It uses our tools, mimics our behaviors, appears in forms that are almost normal until you look closer. It's as if the phenomenon is evolving, finding new ways to bridge the gap between its reality and ours. Some researchers have noted parallels between Wendigo encounters and other anomalous phenomena. The way witnesses describe time distortion, the failure of electronic equipment, the sense of being in a space that doesn't quite align with normal geography. These elements appear in various paranormal accounts worldwide, suggesting either a common psychological response to extreme stress or overlapping phenomena that our compartmentalized science fails to recognize as connected. There's a classified report, leaked in fragments online, suggesting that certain government agencies take the Wendigo phenomenon seriously enough to have protocols in place. Search and rescue teams in specific regions receive training on anomalous missing person patterns. They're taught to recognize signs that a disappearance might involve what they euphemistically call non-standard factors. These include tracks that change size mid-stride, camps that show signs of occupation days after the occupant vanished, and most tellingly, cases where multiple unconnected witnesses report seeing the missing person in different locations simultaneously, always heading deeper into the wilderness, always alone, always wrong somehow. The protocols supposedly include instructions to not pursue beyond certain geographical boundaries, to not investigate during specific weather conditions, and most mysteriously, to never respond to calls for help that come from areas where no one should be. There are stories, unconfirmed but persistent, of rescue teams that violated these protocols and returned changed. Not physically, but psychologically altered in ways that led to their quiet removal from active duty. As we approach the present day, the Wendigo legend faces a curious paradox. Our technology should make it easier to document, study, and explain these encounters. Thermal cameras, satellite tracking, DNA analysis, all tools that should definitively prove or disprove the creature's existence. Yet the phenomenon persists in the gaps, in the places where our technology fails or shows us things we can't quite process. It's as if the Wendigo exists in the spaces between pixels, in the static between signals, in the shadows our lights create rather than eliminate. Indigenous elders speak of this with knowing smiles. They say the Wendigo has always existed where human comprehension fails, that it feeds not just on flesh but on the breakdown of understanding itself. In their view, our attempts to capture and categorize it only make us more vulnerable. The more we seek it with our instruments, the more we invite it into our world. Every photograph that shows something almost visible, every recording that captures something almost audible, every measurement that almost makes sense, these aren't failures of documentation. They're successful contacts with something that exists primarily in the space between known and unknown. The winter of 2023 provided what might be the most compelling evidence yet, though it raises more questions than it answers. A documentary crew, investigating Wendigo sightings for a major streaming service, set up an elaborate array of cameras and sensors in a valley near Manitoulin Island. For 2 weeks, they recorded nothing unusual. On the 15th night, all their equipment activated simultaneously. Every camera, regardless of direction, captured the same image. A figure, impossibly tall, standing in the center of their camp. But here's what defies explanation. The timestamp shows all cameras recording the same moment, but from perspectives that would require the figure to be in multiple places at once. Thermal imaging showed it as both freezing cold and burning hot simultaneously. Motion sensors triggered in a pattern that suggested something moving at speeds that would tear a physical body apart. The audio is even more disturbing. Multiple voices, all speaking simultaneously in various indigenous languages, translated later as variations of the same phrase. The hunger spreads through watching. The crew evacuated immediately, but one member, a sound engineer named Marcus Webb, returned alone 3 days later. His colleagues found him a week afterward, alive but changed. He'd lost 40 pounds despite having ample supplies. He claimed he hadn't eaten because he was full, had never been hungrier and never been less able to eat. Medical examination revealed his stomach had somehow shrunk to nearly nothing, though he showed no signs of surgery or trauma. Webb refuses to discuss what happened during those missing days, but his notebook was recovered. The entries progress from rational observation to something else entirely. The final pages aren't words but patterns. Symbols that hurt to look at directly, arrangements that seem to move when you're not watching them. Linguists who've examined them report experiencing intense hunger that persists for days afterward, a gnawing emptiness that food doesn't satisfy. This brings us to the present moment, to you, listening to or reading these words. Every story shared, every account examined, creates a connection. The Wendigo, if we accept even the possibility of its existence, spreads through consciousness as much as through physical space. By learning about it, we open a door. By thinking about it, we invite it closer. This isn't meant to frighten you. It's meant to make you aware. Awareness might be the only protection we have. Listen carefully to your thoughts over the coming days. Notice if your dreams take you to frozen forests you've never visited. Pay attention to any unusual hunger, especially if it seems disconnected from your body's actual needs. And if you find yourself planning a winter camping trip to somewhere remote, somewhere isolated, ask yourself where that desire really comes from. The indigenous peoples who first named this phenomenon understood something our modern world has forgotten. Some knowledge carries a cost. Some stories, once heard, can't be unheard. The Wendigo isn't just a creature in the forest. It's an idea that hunts, a concept that consumes, a possibility that becomes more real with every telling. But perhaps that's the ultimate truth hidden in this legend. The Wendigo has always been about choice. The choice to cross lines that shouldn't be crossed. The choice to feed hungers that shouldn't be fed. The choice to become something more or less than human. Every person who disappeared into those frozen forests made a choice, even if they didn't understand it at the time. Every transformation began with a decision, conscious or unconscious, to step outside the boundaries that keep us human. So we return to the question posed at the beginning. Is the Wendigo a myth designed to warn against the dangers of greed and cannibalism? Or is there something real still stalking the frozen woods? Something that waits with infinite patience for the right person, the right moment, the right hunger to manifest? The answer might be both. The answer might be neither. The answer might be something our language doesn't have words for yet. Something that exists in the space between mythology and reality, between psychology and physics, between what we know and what we fear to know. As you sit in the safety of your home, surrounded by the warmth and light of civilization, consider this. Every year, hundreds of people vanish in the North American wilderness. Most are found, explained, categorized, but some aren't. Some leave traces that don't make sense, stories that don't fit, evidence that suggests something our modern world isn't prepared to acknowledge. Somewhere out there, in valleys that maps don't quite capture correctly, in forests where compass needles spin without reason, something walks on legs that used to be human. It remembers warmth but can no longer feel it. It remembers satisfaction but can no longer achieve it. It remembers being like you, safe and certain and human, before it heard the call that all of us carry in the darkest corners of our consciousness. The Wendigo isn't coming for you. It doesn't need to. It's already here, waiting in the place where desperation meets opportunity, where survival overrides morality, where the human becomes something else. It's in every story of cannibalism, every act of consuming others for our own survival, every moment when we look at another person and see something less than human. Perhaps the most terrifying truth about the Wendigo is that it's not an invasion from outside. It's an emergence from within. The potential has always been there, coded into our DNA, lurking in the primitive parts of our brain that remember when we were prey as often as predator. Civilization is the thin ice we walk on, and the Wendigo is what waits in the dark water below, patient as winter, hungry as the void between stars. The next time you're in a forest and the world goes quiet, when the birds stop singing and even the wind holds its breath, remember this. That silence isn't empty. Something is listening. Something is watching. Something is waiting for you to take that first step off the path, to venture just a little too far from the light, to let your guard down for just a moment too long. And in that moment, in that space between one heartbeat and the next, you might hear it. The sound that doesn't belong to any animal you know. The footstep that falls just out of sync with your own. The whisper that speaks your name in a voice that's almost but not quite human. When that happens, and statistics suggest that for some of you you'll face the same choice that every Wendigo witness has faced. Do you run, holding tight to your humanity, fleeing back to the world of electric lights and locked doors? Or do you turn, do you look, do you take that first step toward understanding something that might cost you everything you are? The choice is yours. It always has been. It always will be. But remember this as you make it. Every Wendigo was once a person who thought they were strong enough, smart enough, civilized enough to resist. Every monster in those frozen forests once sat where you sit now, confident in their humanity, certain of their moral boundaries, sure they would never cross the line that separates us from them. They were wrong. The wind is picking up outside. The temperature is dropping. Somewhere, in a forest you'll never visit, on a lake you'll never cross, in a valley you'll never enter, something that was once human lifts its head and scents the air. It smells fear. It smells curiosity. It smells the tiny crack in certainty that might, given the right pressure, become a door. And it smiles with too many teeth, knowing that winter is coming, knowing that hunger is patient, knowing that every story told brings it closer to the world we've built to keep it out. The Wendigo isn't just a legend. It's a promise that some hungers can never be satisfied, a promise that some transformations can't be reversed, a promise that somewhere, in the space between human and inhuman, between civilization and wilderness, between the story and the truth, something waits with infinite patience for the moment when we finally understand that the real monster was never out there in the forest. It was always in here with us, waiting to be born. Sleep well tonight, if you can. And if you hear something scratching at your window, something that sounds almost like branches in the wind but not quite, something that patterns itself like words you almost understand, remember that you asked for this story. You sought this knowledge. You opened this door. The rest is up to you. But before you close your eyes, before you surrender to sleep and dreams you can't control, ask yourself one question. That hunger you feel, the one that seems to grow stronger as the night deepens, the one that no amount of food quite satisfies, is it yours? Or is it theirs? The answer might be the last human thought you have.